So I'm going to show you first the outline of my talk. So just very quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the problem as I kind of see it, and as we kind of addressed it in the research that we did. And then, yeah, I'll talk about the special journal issue that we put together and key findings from that, which kind of point to how exactly we might be able to benefit from failure, if we want to benefit from failure, and then I'll draw some conclusions at the end. So, I think that probably many of you, if not all of you, probably would have heard about John Dewey's comment that failure is instructive, okay, and that a person who really thinks should be able to learn as much from experiences of failure as from experiences of success. Sounds familiar? Anyway, generally speaking, in education, there is a general belief that we should benefit from failure, that failure is something which is important for the learning processes and that sort of thing. The basic problem that happens in this area, though, is that in reality, even if we sort of like say we should benefit from failure, and we have a lot of sayings like never give up, and we must persist, and we should try again, okay, and gambate, you know, and that kind of thing. There's a lot of those kinds of sayings, but when you actually come down to it, there's not really much there in terms of, so if we are going to benefit from failure, what exactly should we do? And you sort of like say, well, you should never give up. You should try again, you know, that sort of thing. So in the end, though, there's nothing that's really specific enough that would sort of like guide a person about how exactly it is that they might sort of like benefit from failure if they did fail. So generally speaking, it's more like this. So in reality, what happens is you fail, and you might sort of like at first try, and then you fail again, and increasingly what happens is that many of us actually have a lot of experiences where we did fail and we didn't benefit from the failure, and probably the failure actually ended up making us feel bad, and we didn't sort of like really learn anything from it. And what's worse is that there is actually a general fear of failure that a lot of people suffer from. Like they don't want to try something in case they're going to fail. Okay, it's better not to try something in case you end up being embarrassed and sort of like feeling like, you know, well, you tried something and then everyone sort of like kind of saw you sort of like trying, then you kind of failed, and so it's probably better not to try that. So there's a lot of missed opportunities that people have that people don't get, the opportunities people don't get because they didn't try in the first place. And so this is the problem as we saw it. And when we did search to look for is there anything out there that sort of like tells you what specifically, or what specific steps, what kinds of things you can do, especially in educational settings, to benefit from failure, we only really found one very specific thing. There's a few sort of like minor things, but I don't know if any of you have any of you come across productive failure, Manu Kapoor's productive failure. So Manu Kapoor, I think it was in 2008, published this research where he described a method whereby with teaching statistics to children, what he did with school children. What he did was he actually got the children to work on a problem which was extremely difficult. So it was very, very difficult. So the end product of it was that the children struggled and struggled and struggled with trying to work on the problems, and then they failed and they failed and they failed. And then in the end, after struggling through these difficult statistics problems, what they did was they actually instructed them. So before that, they didn't teach them anything. So they just got them to work on these problems, and then afterwards they taught them. And then what they found in this research is that the students who actually had to struggle and fail subsequently did much better in learning and being able to transfer what they've learned to new problems and that sort of thing, compared to other children who were taught first. So compared to those who were taught first and then they just did the usual, like in school, you learn something and then you go do the problems and that sort of thing. The ones who had the experience of struggling beforehand actually ended up doing much, much better. So this is why it's called productive failure. So this is one method that kind of indicates that there is something that we can do to benefit from failure, but we couldn't really find much else apart from this. So what Manu and I talked about this, and we decided, well, let's try and see if we can harness international sort of like expertise on this and put together a special issue of ways in which failure can be utilized in educational context to make failure more beneficial. And the outcome of it is this special issue on the role of, the journal itself is called Thinking Skills and Creativity. So we had to kind of tailor the title of the special issue to the role of failure in promoting thinking skills and creativity. So this came out in December of 2018, last year, and the issue itself contains 16 research papers. All of them are new. We require that the contributors have papers that would sort of like present new evidence, but also would actually be based on not just what they think. We didn't want just opinions and that kind of thing, like research papers that are just opinions. We wanted them to be at least based on some data or some sort of like evidence that shows that what they're talking about as ways of benefiting from failure is based on something. This is just benefits of working with somebody who's Manu is actually at ETH in Zurich, so as a consequence of working with him, I was able to go to a conference in Zurich. He didn't pay for it, I had to pay for it, but anyway. The point is, there was an excuse for me to go to Zurich and say, well, but I'm going to visit Manu Kapoor, I'm writing putting together a special issue with him. So this was when we came and visited him. So anyway, getting to the point of, so how exactly can we benefit from failure, which is what I'm talking about tonight. There are 15 papers, as I said before. I can't really talk about all of the 15 papers in 20 minutes, so I'll just select some of the papers, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw out some of the, I suppose, the conditions, the requirements of how it is that we might be able to benefit from failure. So this is the first one. Several of the papers in the issue point out that how people internally represent failure influences responses to it. So what that basically means, in simple terms, is if failure is represented as something that can be overcome, the responses to it are far more positive. Okay, so the representation, the internal and external representation. So I'm going to talk about an example of a research that was about the internal representation of failure, which is actually our research paper. So this is a paper that I did with Yoshi Oyama. Yoshi Oyama is at Chiba University, close to, in Tokyo. The idea for this research was that way back in the 1930s, I think it was, Ernest Hemingway said that when he was asked about how do you keep kind of productive in the way that you work and keep sort of like productive all of the time instead of like getting stuck. And he said that the best way is always to stop when you're going good. You know what will happen next. If you do that every day when you are writing a novel, you will never be stuck. So based on this idea, what we thought was that, okay, so if people actually fail to finish something, but they perceive that they are actually close to achieving what it is that they failed to finish, that they would probably be more motivated to actually finish that thing later on or try again than if somebody perceived that they're too far away. Okay, so this is essentially the Hemingway effect that we tested, and we did this. We tested this on university students, and we gave them this. First, we gave them this copying task. So they had to actually copy a Japanese script. And they, before they could finish, they had columns of Japanese script to copy. Before they could finish, we stopped them. Okay, so that when they got stopped, they actually had to count the number of scripts, kanji scripts, characters, and kind of script characters that they hadn't been able to write. And then they also had to rate how motivated are you to actually do this task again, to finish it. Okay, and what we found was that the students who were closer to actually finishing when they had to stop were the ones who were significantly more motivated to actually try again. We didn't, of course, require them to try it again, but they indicated that they were more motivated to try it again. So this is one thing that we found, that the motivation to complete a task that a person has actually previously failed to complete would be higher the closer that person perceives he or she is to finishing the task. But there was a second thing, because we thought, well, this is pretty artificial, this task of, like how many students would actually copy kanji script just from something and then another piece of paper. So in the second task that we gave them, the second study, what we did was to actually ask them to write a story about, or a short sort of like piece about their experiences in school. But for some of the students, what we did was we gave them a structure. We said for the first half, you should write about your experiences in elementary school through to junior high school, and then high school in the second half of it. The other ones, we actually didn't give them any structure, so they can just write about their experiences in school. And what we found was that, again, we stopped them before they could finish. Okay, but what we found was that the Hemingway effect, this effect of feeling motivated to complete something, the closer you are to finishing it, only applied to the ones who actually had this structure. Okay, we didn't find that effect on the ones who didn't have the structure. So I put in here that as an additional necessary condition that a person needs to have is to be able to gauge what more needs to be done to complete the unfinished task. Okay, so if so these two conditions, if you have failed to finish something and then you feel that you're reasonably close to it and you know what it is that you're actually going to have to do to finish it, probably you will try again and finish it. On the other hand, if you feel like it's too far away, or that you kind of feel like, well, yeah, it's close, but I don't really know what I'm supposed to do, so maybe if I try again I could finish it, maybe I can't, sort of thing, then probably you won't be as motivated. So that's the first sort of like study that I want to mention. You can ask me questions about it later on if you want. The second study that I'm going to talk about is this one from Dana Weiss and colleagues at Ben Gurion University in Israel. And what they investigated was the situation where teachers actually talk to each other about teaching failures, pedagogical failures. So the teachers in this school actually meet regularly to actually discuss things that they've not been able to resolve in their classes, like they didn't successfully teach something. And what these researchers did was to actually examine what works in those situations, so that they actually get useful, constructive sort of like discussions about how to move forward and resolve the kinds of issues in teaching that come up, failures in teaching. And what they found was that productive framing, that means the way that you actually present the failed experience in teaching, included situations where the person acknowledges the difficulty of the problem. So in conveying it to other people, so representing it to other people, they acknowledge that this is difficult. Another one is understanding the difficulties that students have with such problems. So the understanding that students will have problems with these kinds of issues, and considering alternative approaches to teaching. On the other hand, what they found that was not very effective was that unproductive failing included normalizing the problem. So when the teachers actually present the problems as, well, it's normal, everyone sort of like has a problem with that, it doesn't go any further. Okay, there's no further sort of like benefit from discussing it. Another one is framing the problem as something that will go away naturally. Don't worry about it. It'll sort itself out. You don't need to do anything. Okay, so no one does anything, and nothing happens. The other one is focusing on success. This happens in situations where a teacher talks about failure in teaching that they've had, but then some other teachers sort of like said, I never had those kinds of problems in my classes. It all goes sort of like smoothly like this, and then it kind of kills the discussion about what you can do to actually improve that situation. Another one is focusing on things that cannot be changed. Well, we can't do anything about this, okay? The Ministry of Education requires that we teach it this way, so leave it at that. So it doesn't go any further with that. So this study points to as I said, the fact that it's important how we frame failure, both internally, how we represent it internally, as well as externally to other people, and how other people will then respond to the experiences of failure. How are you doing for time? 4 minutes? Okay, so just very quickly, I won't go through the details. Beliefs about effort and ability matter is another thing. So when students believe the importance of effort, then they're more likely to persist and try harder when they experience failure. So this is a situation where, I won't talk about this, but these researchers from Taiwan actually found that the students in their study were more likely to benefit from failure when they actually believe that effort is the most important thing. The ones who actually believe more in the idea that they have natural abilities and that sort of thing, they don't tend to try again in subsequent sort of like situations where they've failed at something. So that's the short version of that one. And this is another one. The learning environment, okay, needs to be accepting and supportive of failure. So students need to be assured that making mistakes and taking risks could lead that could lead to failure is acceptable. This is very, very important too. It doesn't matter how much we say to students, you should benefit from failure and you should try and don't be afraid to fail and that kind of thing. When in fact, if they did fail, they're going to suffer for it. Okay, this is the problem. So in this research that Andrea Gomol and colleagues at Indiana University did, they were working with robotics. This is school robotics, and they encourage students to fail fast and often, because in the process of failing fast and often, they can eliminate the methods that actually don't work. But if they sort of like hesitate because they're afraid that they might sort of like make a mistake and fail, then it takes them much, much longer, and they're more likely to not find the correct solution to how the robot can work effectively. Okay, so this is the quick version of number 3. Number 4, teacher and student skills in utilizing failure need to be cultivated. Without training, there is a real danger that even with the best intentions, teachers and students would gain nothing from failure experiences if they don't know how to actually deal with it. So the idea is that constructive criticism, okay, we all think that constructive criticism is really good and beneficial and that sort of thing. It isn't, okay? So essentially there are requirements for how constructive failure can be beneficial. And the first one is regarding the feedback giver. The feedback giver needs to be perceived as someone who is respect-worthy and caring. Okay, if the students don't perceive their teachers as respect-worthy and caring, they don't follow their advice. Okay, so it doesn't matter what feedback they provide them, no benefit, almost. Okay, and the feedback receiver, that's the students usually. They also need something. Okay, they need to be able to handle the complex set of emotions and motivations that they experience after they've failed at something. So this also requires some kind of training for them to benefit from failure. Because even if the teacher provides them with feedback, but they're sort of like rejecting of them because they just failed and they just don't want to know anything about it, then again, they don't benefit from failure. Short version number 4. Okay, this is the last one. So patience is necessary to allow benefits of failure to emerge. In this study by actually Manu Kapoor and Esther Ziegler at ETH Zurich, what they found was that the students who were more constructive in the examples that they generated for some math equations and that sort of thing, they made more mistakes, and so they failed and they actually didn't do so well in the initial tests. But because they generated more constructive examples, they actually ended up benefiting more from that. And later on, in subsequent tests, they found a significant relationship between whether or not the students generated more constructive, creative sort of like examples and failed more, and subsequent sort of like ability to use the equations and actually extend them, transfer them to other problems later on, compared to the other ones who just sort of like generated very simple sort of like examples in that. So these are my conclusions now. So there are conditions necessary for failure to lead to beneficial outcomes and success. And we need to know those conditions, like what I talked about, and I can answer your questions about those again shortly. And we also need skills to turn those conditions into reality. Those skills need to be cultivated in schools, in both teachers and students. Otherwise, like schools are supposed to be where you learn the kinds of skills, competencies, and that sort of thing. If they don't learn those things, then we turn out people who are going to go into the society thinking, yes, you should benefit from failure, but I have no idea how. And so sooner or later, just give up and don't benefit from failure and start fearing failure and not taking chances to, in case they fail, sort of thing. So we'll finish it. Yeah. Thank you.
Floor is open for questions. Yeah, we got a couple.
So your topic was about education.
Yeah.
To what extent are these conditions that you found that determine how much somebody benefits from failure, are they transferable to other fields like business, for example?
I think so. Yeah, I think well, of course we haven't investigated this, but in terms of the findings, I think that most of them, if you actually have a look at them, most of them can be useful in even in, like for example the first one, because I know that because it's our research. If you haven't finished something, you're more likely not to procrastinate doing it if you have a good idea of you know how close you are to finishing it and what you need to do. I mean, I also experience that when I'm writing a paper, I tend to procrastinate. Going back to it, even if it's well overdue, if I kind of don't have a good idea of what I need to write next, but if once I have a good plan and I know what to do, it's a lot easier to get back into it.
What I'm getting at is like these are not unique to the educational environment.
No,
These
no,
are
no.
universalizable.
Yeah, transferable, generalizable sort of like conditions. So yeah, I suggest if you have access like to some of these journals, if you have access to this one, have a look. It's yeah.
In regards to research that you've done and you know about, what's the like youngest age range that you know of for like you know like young children in regards to like
Okay. So you mean the studies that were included in there? Some of them were in elementary school research. Yeah. So yeah. So I think essentially, just my opinion, of course, and based on what we found here, that from a young age, I think that children need to be encouraged to not be afraid to fail, because yeah, a lot of children actually learn that from an early age to sort of like hesitate and sort of like, especially if the parents are sort of like really strict and sort of like tend to castigate them for making mistakes and that sort of thing, then yeah, it's not good. I think I quite like the idea of failing fast and failing often, and then actually finding out what doesn't work quickly so that we can sort of like get on with what works, sort of thing. Yeah.
So you said that maybe this should be implemented into a classroom, but like what are some concrete ways that this could be implemented for both teachers and the students?
Yeah, I think, for example, the training for the teachers, I think, is going to be really helpful, and considering things like, you know, how can I actually provide feedback which is not just sort of like general, you know, like constructive feedback, which is too general so that it's not really, it doesn't feel to the student like it's actually geared towards them benefiting from the actual mistakes that they made, and also for children, you know, like students. How do you deal with like when you just failed with something? You know, what do you do? You feel very disappointed. How can you move on from there so that you can actually, you know, like be open to suggestions for how you can improve from your teacher and that sort of thing. And also one of the fundamental problems here, as I see it, is that we can do all of these things, but if the kinds of assessments in schools are actually punitive towards sort of like making mistakes, and then a lot of these things become sort of like difficult to implement. So I can see that, for example, in the schools, and many of the schools in Japan, it's actually very difficult to implement some of these things because everything is based on like assessments, tests, and that sort of thing. And so there are limitations that if we can overcome some of those things, then a lot of these things would be much more beneficial.
Are you doing any further research, and what are your next steps based on
Yeah,
this?
so for us, for example, with the Hemingway effect, there's a couple of things that we're looking at the moment. One of those is that we're interested in finding out whether or not that's generalizable to risk-taking in people. And the other one is there are a lot of people in universities in Japan, and also I come from New Zealand, and in New Zealand there's a lot of people who start like their PhDs and sort of like get stuck, and they miss the deadline, but then they get some sort of like extra sort of like period of grace when they can sort of like maybe they can just resubmit and that sort of thing. So at the moment we're exploring the possibility of actually trying to apply these principles to those people if we can get enough participants who are stuck and have failed to finish, but they may be able to sort of like finish again. So yeah, that's the next two steps that we're thinking of, and with regards to the Hemingway effect. Yeah.
I think we got time for one more question.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's where the perception comes into it. Yeah. So we didn't get any research studies submitted to us that directly dealt with emotional sort of like things, but with regards to like the person themselves, how they view, for example, the relative sort of like importance of natural ability, as I said before, and effort, for example, how they view those things makes a difference. How they view the failure situation as something that is manageable or not manageable makes a difference. How the person actually portrays the failure situation to other people would affect how other people will respond to them about it, and can then sort of like then influence the extent to which they might be able to benefit from what they've experienced. Because if other people sort of like then start sort of like not supporting them because they sort of like, well, everyone sort of like makes that mistake, don't worry about it, you don't need to do anything, then nothing happens sort of like thing. So there's a lot of those kinds of things, but I take your point that there are also other more sort of like emotion-based sort of things that we still need to examine in this area. And I think that there is a lot of research in this area. Actually, I didn't mention this, but when we made the call for papers, we had over 45 submissions coming in of like the abstract, sort of like people saying we want to write a paper for this, and that actually didn't quite all materialize. It materialized to about 25, I think 26 sort of like papers, and out of that we had to select the 15 to actually make into the issue. So there's a lot of interest in this area, I think, and just last month, was it? Yeah, in April, there was a short article in Scientific American that actually mentioned this thing, sort of like saying that that you can benefit from failure. So they picked up the special issue and wrote something about it. So.
Sorry, last question you had.
So I was wondering if for young kids, because sometimes they're afraid of taking the risk of failure, as young as preschool.
Yeah.
So I've noticed that in elementary they also when they fail, they cry.
Yeah.
So most of the time, because their emotional attachment to it, and because they made it a big deal, especially for Asian kids. So I was wondering how long. I mean, this the question is what will be the effect of it in the long run when they become adults?
If they just keep being afraid of failing, is that what you mean?
Yeah, if they never tried failure
as young as preschool. If
Yeah, I
everything's
think
done-
that would probably make the person more sort of like hesitant with a lot of things. That's why that's why I suggested that probably we should try and address this, and it's an important issue in society that, well, for parents, teachers, for example, it's good to model things, for example. So I think that often, especially in Japan, I've noticed that teachers don't want to make a mistake. So they have this sense that the teacher is always right, and that sort of. I think it's important for teachers to actually model that teachers don't know everything, and that they can also make mistakes and that sort of thing, so that students themselves will feel that it's okay to make a mistake and that sort of thing. I think that's quite critical, and I think that also applies to parents, acknowledging that everyone makes mistakes, and that what the important thing is that we actually get something from the mistakes that we make, that we can move on and actually benefit from those situations. So yeah, but I think if I understand your question, I think the answer to that is if they don't overcome that fear of actually making a mistake, then yeah, we all know people who are like that, who never actually take on things that they're afraid to might lead to failure. So yeah,
Okay.
especially important things.
Shall we wrap up? Okay, thank you very much.